first session, the first keynote, is delivered by Professor Robert Simanowski. And as you see, it's about literature and digital media, notes on theory and aesthetics. Professor Robert Simanowski is a scholar of media and cultural studies and holds a PhD in literary studies and a Vini Legendi in media studies. He is the founder and editor of the Journal on Digital Culture and Aesthetics, digitaldigital.org, and the author of several books on digital culture and politics, including Digital Art and Meaning, Data Love and Facebook Society, Digital Humanities and Digital Media, Conversations on Politics, Culture, Aesthetics and Literacy, as well as Waste, a New Media Primer, and the Death of Algorithm and Other Digital Dilemmas. Robert worked as a professor of German studies at Brown University and as a professor of digital media studies and digital humanities at University of Basel and at City University of Hong Kong. He lives as media consultant, op-ed contributor and author in Berlin and Rio de Janeiro. Thank you, Professor Robert Simanowski, for being with us. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the introduction. It's also a pleasure for me and for the invitation to be here and to serve as the keynote speaker for this conference on teaching digital literature. And I hope to be able to share with you my view on the past and the future of digital literature and its role in the bigger environment of higher education. And after having listened to the introductory address and what I understood from Luciana's translation from the Portuguese part, I wished I had come with a different talk here, because that was all obviously about the thoughts that I discussed, the ideas that I discussed in my last book, Stumme Medien, which would be roughly translated mute media, the disappearance of the computer in education and society. There I discuss why we need such critical digital literacy that was demanded in this introductory address, and how we could do this, how that could be situated in the environment of higher education in an institution, in an institutional perspective. Now, I did not prepare that talk. I prepared a talk more about the aesthetic of digital literature, but feel free to ask me afterwards, and I will hang around here for the rest of the conference. So there may be ways that I can then still provide my thoughts on this. And as I said, ask me also in the Q&A that we probably have afterwards. Now, the first observation I would like to make is actually no observation, but a confession, which may or may not surprise or disappoint you, depending on how you see the subject at hand. I have to confess that I was never a strong believer in digital literature as a new, exciting literary genre. At least I had my doubts concerning hyperfiction, the first representative of what later was called electronic or digital literature. Back then, in the end of the 1990s, there were two camps when it came to hyperfiction: the believers and the skeptics. A representative of the first was Mark Bernstein, founder of Eastgate Systems, the best-known publisher of electronic literature or hyperfiction, and director of the Electronic Literature Organization from its inception in 1999 to May 2003. And I remember well the title of Bernstein's keynote at the Hypertext Conference 1999 in Darmstadt, Germany. Where are the hypertexts? Bernstein's question reacted to hyperfiction's failure to attract mainstream attention. His answer was at once self-critical and appeasing. He blamed it on the lack of marketing and was convinced the masses would love hyperfiction as soon as they got to know it. Now, a representative of the other camp, the skeptics, was Marie-Laure, a prominent scholar in the field of narratology and cyberculture. And in her 2001 book, Narrative as Virtual Reality, Immersion and Interactivity in Literature and Electronic Media, Ryan calls for a kind of tamed hyperfiction, one that avoids what back then was considered an avant-garde-like advantage of multilinearity in hyperfiction, being lost in the labyrinth of text chunks. While other scholars, such as Yellowy Douglas in 2000 in her monograph, The End of Books, or Books Without End, Reading Interactive Narratives, celebrated the random, chaotic, and unpredictable narration in hyperfiction as a mirror of life, Ryan held that while the labyrinth text may be artistically valuable as a unique experience, it can hardly serve as a new narrative formula. In the long run, she said, immersive narrativity is much more viable, pressurable, and diversified than anti-narrativity. As a consequence, Ryan defended a more cohesive reading experience through the concentration of relatively self-contained lexias, such as poems, aphorisms, anecdotes, short narrative episodes, so as to take greater advantage of the multimedia capability of the electronic environment. Not only did such shift from hardly controllable multilinearity to carefully designed multimediality undermine the premature and, to my mind, erroneous celebration of hypertext as the praxis to the popular postmodern theory of the death of the author, but it also foreshadowed the death of hypertext itself. When I published my first monograph in 2002 on digital literature, I sided with Ryan against Bernstein. I had strong doubts that non- or multilinear narration would ever have the aesthetic success that enthusiastic academics and their disciples forecasted in the 1990s. However, this did not prevent me from drawing attention to this new form of aesthetic expression and continuing with many pioneers and scholars of digital literature the discussion of a digital hermeneutics in the online journal Dichtung Digital. You already heard it, that I had founded in 1999 and edited until 2014. Yes, I was skeptical with regard to nonlinear literature or the nonlinear feature of digital literature, but I never questioned the value of the study of digital literature. I felt then, as I do now, that it is as a subject worthy of academic treatment as one of the many cornerstones to help us understand what today we experience under the umbrella term of digital revolution. For this reason, I refrained from moving on from the subject of digital literature to the subject of digital art and digital culture without first engaging in thorough discussions of two subgenres of digital literature in my 2011 habilitation, Digital Art and Meaning, Reading Kinetic Poetry, Text Machines, Mapping Art, and Interactive Installations. In fact, I also dealt with the very topic of this conference and invited scholars from different academic institutions in Europe and the United States to share their opinions and experiences concerning the teaching of digital literature. The result of this undertaking, carried out alongside dear and long-time collaborators Peter Gendola and Jürgen Schäfer from the University of Siegen, was published in 2010 under the title Reading Moving Letters, Digital Literature in Research and Teaching, a Handbook. Since then, other books have been published on the nature of digital literature and the ways of its research and teaching. I'm sure you are familiar with Analyzing Digital Fiction, edited by Alice Bell, Astrid Enslin, and Hans Christian Hustad from 2014, and with Scott Redberg's Electronic Literature from last year. Scott, who together with his wife, Jill, and the help of many international contributors, has turned the University of Bergen into a hub of research and teaching of digital literature, rightly makes the claim that electronic literature demands to be read both through the lens of experimental literary practices, harking back as far as combinatoric lyric of the Baroque, as well as through the specificities of the technology underlying the production and reproduction of the works. With this book, Scott provides a logical structure and focus to a pedagogical approach to digital literature or electronic literature, respectively, which serves as a backbone for a semester-long course. I cannot recommend enough that you read this book if you haven't done so yet, and I look forward to Scott's keynote tomorrow to hear how he teaches electronic literature with electronic literature. As for the rest of my keynote, rather than repeating what I have said in the books I have written and edited on the subject of digital literature, I thought I would focus on an issue that supplements Scott's plea that scholars pay due attention to the historical as well as the technical specificities of digital literature. In my book, Digital Art and Meaning, I stressed the importance of close readings. Naturally, in the case of digital literature, such close readings tend to cover a variety of semiotic elements and include, aside from the linguistic and visual signs, also the actions of the work as well as its interactions with the audience. Today I want to stress that in addition to the close readings of a single work, we need to read the underlying trend which that work represents. This may be called a media ontological reading, in that it aims at the ontology of media, something which the father of media studies, Marshall McLuhan, would have called the message of the medium. The challenge, of course, is to find the hidden message, which requires both detective flair and intellectual courage. What this courage means, how such flair may look like, I wish to illustrate with 4 examples, not from hyperfiction, but from digital literature, though the more appropriate term in these cases may be digital art. This change in attribution is already part of the point I eventually want to make. My starting point, however, is very much in line with the place of this conference, the former colony of Portugal, Brazil, where a special mode of rejecting and appropriating colonial power has been offered based on an element of Brazil that is normally less famous than caipirinha and bossa nova, namely cannibalism. The idea of one person eating another often serves as an explanatory model for cultural phenomena in modern times, as is exemplified by Bell Hooks' 1992 essay on partnership entitled Eating the Other. Hooks' subject is not the usual metaphors applying to lovers who simply devour one another. Instead, she is interested in racist snacking. In cross-racial dating, Hooks contends white men seek adventures with black women to add the spice of an exotic experience to their middle-class future with white women. The other, which Hooks defines as the foreign ethnicity and culture of the partner in this experience, never becomes a fixed part of the man's life. On the contrary, the women are merely tried out and come with an inherent sell-by date. The other is consumed and forgotten. Such snacking is racist precisely because it never progresses beyond snacking. A decade later, Lisa Nakamura applied this sort of metaphoric cannibalism to the internet. This time, the subject matter was role-playing with identities in cyberspace, specifically with white males using female Asian avatars with handles like Miss Saigon and Geisha Guest. Nakamura considers this form of dressing up and making believe with a foreign ethnic identity a form of empty tourism, which doesn't enrich the role player in any way. It is symbolic appropriation of another's ethnic identity that is tried out for fun and without any consequences. Hooks and Nakamura use cannibalism as a shorthand metaphor with pejorative connotations. But back in 1928, in the Brazilian modernist writer Oswald de Andrade, elevated it into a cultural creed in his manifesto Antropophago. By anthropophagy, he meant a ritualistic cannibalism, which he promoted as a way of finding Brazilian identity. Brazilians, de Andrade argued, should neither ignore nor submit to European cultural influences. They should accept, internalize, and digest it with irony, parody, and disrespect. If we apply the cultural and philosophical idea of cannibalism at work in all these cases through the lens of media theory, we can identify various digital media phenomena as forms of transmedia cannibalism. Here, the other is the revert medium of written text, whose symbolic consumption and devour takes place as it is transformed into a post-literal object and a musicalized event. Now, one early example of this constellation, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is Romy Architov and Camille Atterbeck's interactive installation Text Train from 1999. For those who are not familiar with it, I continue with my description. Individual letters descend slowly from the entire upper surface of a projection screen, and when observers approach the screen, they see their own image recorded and projected by a hidden camera. This person that you see here is actually in front of the screen, and as you see, the letters land on her arm because they are programmed in a way that they stop when they meet something dark, a shadow on the screen. And in this way, you can collect the letters, you can let them fall, catch them again, and you can even read them. The installation was particularly successful because it allowed observers to encounter text in such a special way. Suddenly, letters were no longer linguistic bearers of meaning that needed to be decoded, although that was in fact possible since the letters were taken from a poem and formed words and lines if observers were patient enough to collect them. But of course, hardly anyone thought of putting the letters together and reading them when they could be scooped up with an umbrella and balanced on fingertips. Experience showed that the audience didn't pay much attention to the text in Text Train. Another example is Bitfall by Julius Popp from 2006. He's a German artist. In this roughly 2-meter high and 5-meter wide installation, hundreds of dwarfs released drops of water so that they formed letters. And meanwhile, horizontally, the letters formed words. The words were taken from internet announcements of world events and had a visual life of only 2 or 3 seconds. As Pop himself said, this waterfall of letters was supposed to express the fleeting nature of what we think is important. Of course, the irony is that the words disappeared before they have even truly appeared. From the very beginning, they are not read as meaningful series of letters, but rather viewed as a fascinating phenomenon. We don't read words made of water. We touch them, we stick our arms into them, we wet our brows with them, and we jump through them. Words of water can also be enjoyed from the rear. Like text rain, Bitfall invites people to encounter text on the visual actionist level. Meaning plays no role in this encounter. The text doesn't want to be decoded, just seen. The central, indeed essential characteristic of these cannibalistic text installations is that text is present as non-text and as contradictory presence. The text must remain present behind and specifically in the surprising way it appears, which wows observers. If letters are replaced by sand, as in the 2001 installation Sand by Zachary both Simpson and Ken Demarest, which otherwise is similar to text rain in the way it functions and makes observers interact with it, the work loses its anthropophagic basis. Unlike text, sand has no cultural value, and thus, as an object of interaction, it cannot appear to observers as fallen, symbolically disempowered language. There's something pornographic in Fredric Jameson's sense of the visual as per se pornographic about a text that merely wants to be viewed, not decoded. Like pornography, it encourages enraptured, defenseless gazing. The letters in the text in text rain and Bitfall appear in such a way that their physical manifestation can no longer be combined into a statement. They do not want viewers to see beyond them to something they describe. They want to be stared at hypnotically as people do when they gaze upon a waterfall or a naked body, from which they can't avert their eyes. Paradoxically, the hypnotized gaze is also the result of a work that would seem to be the opposite of text rain and Bitfall. In Bruno Nadeau and Jason Lewis' 2005 installation Still Standing, letters lying around on the bottom of the screen form themselves into a short 40-word text in the silhouette of observers if they remain standing motionless in front of the screen for a few seconds. The text criticizes the befuddlement of our time, which it also seeks to correct by forcing those who would read it to stand still and watch. So is the text, in a kind of reverse cannibalism, exploiting this effect in the interest of the venerable cultural technique of reading? That is the case only for the first glance, because the rebellion scarcely extends further than its immediate effect on viewers. Would observers pause to watch for longer if the text were to be constantly renewed and present 400 or 4,000 words to be read? Technically, it would be no problem to follow the eyes of observers and change the silhouetted text before they turn away. But would the text truly have a chance if it were only text? How long can the text extend the immobilization of observers if, as a body that slows itself to be stared at, it disappears behind the world that it opens up. The artists in question don't press the issue. They keep the moment of standing still and looking as short as possible, and in so doing, present a text that in its very rebellion kowtows before the anthropophagic effect. A better metaphor than Jameson's pornography of the visual is the musicalization of the significant. Music, after all, is never about significance and understanding. Musical sound does not refer to anything beyond itself. It only wants to be perceived in its own physicality. Listening is always staring, which is why in his critique of judgment, Immanuel Kant classified music as one of the free beauties that represent nothing. This metaphor has been popular since Guillaume Apollinaire noted in his 1913 essay, Les Peintres Cubistes, that Cubist and pure painting was to previous painting as music was to literature. In this sense, in 1930, Bela Balázs described absolute or abstract film as optical music that doesn't signify anything but is instead itself unmediated, materialized significance. Writing from the same perspective in 1985, the US art critic Rosalind Krauss understood the abstract painting of the early 20th century as a striving for the condition of music. And in 2004, the German philosopher Martin Seer called action films music for the eye. Like color and form in abstract painting, the post-alphabetic anthropophagized text becomes an object to be observed beyond its traditional role as a semantic sign. Its significance is its withdrawal of significance. The musicalization of the text in digital media reverses the original function of those media. In the 1980s, some people understood the computer as the revenge of the word on television. There were no images, to say nothing of moving ones on computers, and even computer games played themselves out in landscapes of words. In online role-playing, to act was to type. We didn't stand in front of a house, we read, "You are standing in front of a house." We didn't pick up an axe or have our avatar do it. We typed in, "Pick up the axe." The drive toward images and an initial cannibalistic impulse within the computer's possibilities for expression soon expressed itself in the ASCII graphics that were painstakingly put together using the keyboard. Less idiosyncratic, but more important for the computer's eventual triumph was the graphic interface. Since 1984 with the Apple Macintosh and somewhat later in Microsoft's Windows, we no longer have to type in a command like this in order to copy two files. We simply click the mouse on the file's icons and drag them into the folder we want. With Adobe, the graphic user interface was followed by desktop publishing, which rescued computers from the confines of spreadsheets a la Lotus and made them appealing to designers. The rest of the story is well known. In the 1990s, still images became an integral part of computers, then came audio, then video. The visualization of communication in the form of photos and increasingly, as Facebook shows in videos, put an end to the revenge of the word on television, reversing the situation completely. In digital media, too, the Gutenberg galaxy and the literate monopoly, as theorist Marshall McLuhan and Friedrich Kittler called the span of time in which the book was the undisputed leading medium of society, are giving way to the culture of the visual. The history of media is shifting from a model of sense to a model of the senses. With images and sounds, the objects are always simply there, whereas text first needs to be decoded. From the perspective of the history of human civilization, this represents a return to an earlier condition of perception at a higher level of technology. No matter what in fact existed in the very beginning of everything, at the beginning of the word was the image. Before letters, used together, created series of sounds to stand for an object, COW for cow or DOG for dog, they depicted an object. The letter A, which the Phoenicians wrote upside down, imitated an ox. The point was the chin, the horizontal bar, the eyes, and two tips, the horns. Likewise, an M was a snake. The letter visually presented the object depicted much as children acoustically depict a dog when they call it bow wow. Semioticians would call this visual onomatopoeia and speak of an iconic equivalence of signifier and signified. Importantly, the sound of an object had no immediate relationship to its representation in writing. Writing did not, as it does today, make language visible. It depicted an object that language represented in its own different way. An upside-down A, which in Phoenicians designated an ox. Only once pictography was replaced by letters and words did the visual and acoustic signifiers converge. The ox head was turned upside down and no longer stood for an ox, but for the sound with which its oral signifier began, the A in Aleph. The technical term for this is acrophony, the reduction of a sound to its top letter. This clever bit of shorthand was the beginning of various possibilities for combination. As soon as the visual A was no longer an ox head, but rather the sound A, it could be used to form all possible series of sounds for all possible objects, if it were combined with other visual signs that had also been freed from the object they originally designated to become acoustic sounds. Written language no longer needed thousands of characters, as today's Chinese still does, but rather only 25 letters, give or take a few, which users could put together as they chose. Insofar as it increasingly visualizes communication, the computer restores the pictorial nature of the beginning of language. For quite some time, we have no longer needed to describe our avatars on the internet. We simply display them. In general, we describe what we are doing less and less. Instead, we post photos and videos. The visual is displacing written language. At the same time, the visual and the acoustic are becoming language. The abstract process of acrophony of yore was taken to another level by the radical reduction of the alphabet and numerals system of signs to binary code. Just as pictograms and syllables evolve into letters, into lettered language, this reduction too has radically expanded the capacity of the remaining signs to describe things. Every image and every sound can be expressed as a series of zeros and ones and be communicated, for example, via the telephone. No matter what happens on its surface, the computer remains essentially and for most people invisibly a textual medium. While the old culture of text, as it was known in the Gutenberg galaxy, may be disappearing, we are increasingly becoming surrounded by unseen text. The anthropophagic treatment of text, not just in art installations, but in new media generally, recasts it in an act of parody as an invisible presence in the belly of the computer. One artistic commentary on this constellation of text and non-text is a roughly 1 meter high and 4 meter wide picture made of various colored dots from 2007, bearing the title The Complete Works of W.S. What looks like a computerized work of abstract pointillism, a visual painting that seeks only to present itself, in reality represents the word of Shakespeare's writing. The artist, Caleb Larson, actually transformed Shakespeare's collected works into differently colored pixels. Here, the text is consumed in anthropophagic style rather than eradicated. Each color is acrophonically connected to the first letter of its name, B for blue, R for red, and G for green. Bringing Shakespeare's work letter by letter, line by line, play by play, yields a collection of colored points that only seems to be random. Observers may simply stare, impressed, at the massive collection of colored dots, but it's anything but what it appears to be, a radical break from the paradigm of sense in favor of the paradigm of senses. The point of this anthropophagic treatment of text is that the text survives within the effect the work produces, as Jonah once survived in the belly of the whale. The text doesn't get lost when it is confined in this way. It can be translated back into its original form at any time with the proper software. Moreover, with a bit of practice, people can actually read the picture, pixel by pixel, letter for letter. The complete works of W.S. would be a clever and paradoxical answer to the question, what book would you take with you to a desert island? This one picture literally speaks louder than 1,000 words. All you would have to do is learn to read the language of the colors without the aid of a computer, which presumably does not exist on that island. This picture is perhaps the only image that we could say is entirely free of pornography. Staring at it for hours on a hot island day would entail nothing less than seeing through it in a double sense, through the pixels to the letters, and through the letters to a word that exists only inside Shakespeare and his readers. It would be an attempt to reclaim the other, which has been swallowed by the effect produced by digital media, as one's own. Now, as conclusion, I said at the beginning that I wish to share my thoughts on the past and future of this conference subject and its role in the environment of higher education. And as you realized, and as I already apologized in the beginning, I did not provide a canon of works to be taught or thoughts on the didactic of teaching digital literature. This more praxis-oriented take will be delivered by Scott in his keynote tomorrow, I guess. My aim, well, we will see. Well, your abstract gives hope, at least. My aim was to broaden our perspective regarding the range of issues that can and should be taken into account when setting out to teach digital literature. My talk, so I hope, illustrates that we are well advised to think outside the box of literary studies and situate our subjects within the new economy of writing and reading and within the increasing shift to a visual culture and a culture of presence, where meaning is replaced by audiovisual events and technical effects. If you want to know more about how I see this link between digital literature and the culture of presence, ask me or read the introduction to my book on digital art and meaning, which you find on my website, or consult this collection of interviews that you also find free online for the perspective of other scholars on the connection between digital media and digital aesthetics. And as I have been told by my wife, Luciana Gattes, the culture of presence is also the subject of her talk this afternoon. If you want to reread this lecture to better digest my talk, my take on media cannibalism, you will find part of it in my book, The Death Algorithm and Other Digital Dilemmas, which came out last December with MIT Press. If you rather look for concrete advice on how to teach digital literature and according experiences in different academic environments, this is the book I mentioned before with the collection with international scholars. Well, whatever you are looking for, I hope this conference will give you answers and at least ideas for the right questions. And I hope my lecture was inspiring in this regard. And I thank you for your attention. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Professor Robert Simanowski, for your inspiring talk. Now the floor is open to questions, issues, comments.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for your really, I think, wonderful and opening talk. You know, this idea that you've really gone through all the technologies of writing and the history of the media in this brief talk. So one of the questions that I think the way you've been explaining this movement from a regime of sense to a regime of senses is in relation to the issue of teaching and using digital culture critically, is how is it possible to read digital art, digital literature? What are we doing with? So are we changing the way we read? Are we changing the meaning of the concept of reading once we become immersed and called upon by this multimedia sense-oriented system of representation?
Well, definitely. We are changing the way of reading because we only, in the traditional way, read literature or text. Of course, metaphorically, we say we read a sculpture, we read a building, we read paintings. Maybe in painting even it's the closest to text because it works with symbols, as of course architecture does also and art in general. But as people like Gumbrecht have made clear in their plea for a culture of presence, you don't need to apply hermeneutics in this case. You can just enjoy the building. There's more, your body is involved into this experience, and you can just enjoy a painting without asking what it means. That's the difference. We cannot enjoy a text without asking what it means, unless sound poetry. But there are of course, some genres that are at the edge of literature and art, and that play with this. But in general, in text, we do need to know what they represent, the letters, and then we can enjoy this or ask again, what does it mean? Now, with the development of digital culture, and it was mentioned this morning in the introductory address by the Secretary of State, there's a lot of interaction without reading. And I do think there is a move away from linguistic communication to visual communication. Facebook has clearly this aim, and that's the reason why Zuckerberg paid $2,000 billion for Oculus, because he sees the future in an immersive, rather conscienceless sharing of experiences. That may be good in his perspective, but of course not in our perspective, because we know that the medium of language is the medium where we take distance to what is expressed and where we form a critical thinking. So this cultural mode needs to be rescued, but of course we cannot tell the younger generations they should only read books and not engage in all these fancy ways of communication. What we can is to then, and that is the second art of reading in a more metaphorical way, to still ask, what does it mean that this happens, the interaction that happens, or the action of a piece, the pre-programmed actions. What does it mean? Why does it do this now? So not only enjoy it and say, wow, what a great technical effect, but also ask what it does. And that means, for example, as in this piece by US Pop, the Bitfall, that we not only enjoy how the falling water and stand there in awe, but that we also ask how this changes our perspective to words and what he achieves with these effects. And for example, also to see that actually, if he says it wants to indicate the short, what's the word I'm looking for? The fluidity of the information that we consider important, no? That they disappear after seconds. If we see that that in the installation, for example, the water is that there are lights that lighten the words, but that you don't see them on the ground, so that they actually disappear before they actually disappear, before they go on the ground, then you see that he manipulates this idea, and that it is more about the effect than a really appropriate interpretation of the situation, let alone that it is wrong that all those news that are important to us disappear. We know that on the internet they don't disappear. That's the point. I can still look them up, right? So there are a lot of things that you can talk about when you see this technical effect, rather than just say, oh, this is interesting, how did he do this? And then you talk about technical effects. And I think that's something that we as humanists ought to address. This reading of, in this case, of effects, not of letters, but of effects. And in this way, we can still teach an awareness of things, of science, of what, and of meaning. And we can maybe stop a little bit this shift from the paradigm of sense to the paradigm of senses.